2:03 a.m., 42nd floor. Cassandra Mercer sat back in her chair with her eyes closed, her breathing slow and even, her right hand resting loosely beside a stack of documents she was supposed to sign in less than 7 hours. Anyone watching from the doorway would have assumed she had finally fallen asleep at her desk, which is exactly what she needed them to assume. On the desk in front of her, beside the vintage drafting compass she had carried since the beginning, sat the dissolution filing for Mercer Design Systems, 43 pages. The signature line was on page 43, flagged with a yellow tab. By 9 a.m., those pages would either end 21 years of work, or they wouldn't. But Cass wasn't grieving tonight. She was watching. The overnight facilities tech had just pushed his cart through her office door, and Cass needed to know exactly one thing. What does a man do when he believes no one is looking? His answer was going to change everything. Cassandra Mercer had not always been the kind of woman who set traps. 21 years ago, she had launched Mercer Design Systems out of a 2-bedroom apartment in East Nashville with a second-hand workstation and a conviction that the construction industry was decades behind where it needed to be. She wasn't building furniture or flipping houses. She was building parametric design software, tools that let architects model sustainable structures in real time, running cost projections and environmental impact simulations simultaneously before a single beam was ordered. No one believed it would work. Banks turned her down 6 times. The first 3 investors she pitched told her the market wasn't ready. One of them told her kindly that she might want to consider a more realistic pivot. Cass went home that night, sat at her workstation, and coded for 11 hours straight. By the time she was 34, Mercer Design Systems had contracts with 3 of the largest commercial real estate developers in the Southeast. By 38, the firm had expanded to 19 states, and the platform had been licensed by 2 federal agencies. By 42, the company was valued at $1.8 billion, and Cass had an office on the 42nd floor of Mercer Tower with floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides and a view of the Cumberland River that she almost never had time to look at. She had earned every inch of it, and now, in the space of 11 months, she was on the verge of losing all of it. The collapse had not announced itself. It had slipped in quietly, the way the most dangerous things do. Over the past 11 months, Mercer Design Systems had lost 4 of its largest enterprise clients: a commercial developer in Phoenix, a federal housing agency in D.C., a hospital network out of Charlotte, and a smart city infrastructure firm in Seattle. Each time, the reason given was the same. A competitor called Axiom Build had submitted lower bids using proposals that, in Cass's estimation, were uncomfortably close to Mercer's own proprietary strategy documents. She had questioned her pricing team. She had reviewed her sales pipeline twice. She had hired an outside consulting firm to audit the company's competitive positioning. Nothing came back conclusive, but the losses kept coming. And then, 2 months ago, Axiom Build had won the federal green infrastructure contract, a $340 million procurement that Mercer Design Systems had spent 16 months preparing for, submitting a technical framework so specific, so aligned with Mercer's internal methodology, that Cass had stopped sleeping normally the week she found out. 3 days ago, the board of directors had convened an emergency session. 8 people sat across from her in the glass-walled conference room. Her board, the people she had chosen, people she had trusted, and told her that Mercer Design Systems had 60 days of operating capital remaining. The recommendation was structured dissolution, file for Chapter 11, liquidate non-core divisions, negotiate a controlled wind-down. The paperwork would be ready by Friday. Today was Friday. 43 pages of legal language sat on her desk. All she had to do was sign her name at the bottom of page 43, and 21 years of work would begin dying on paper. But Cass wasn't ready to sign, not because she had a plan, not because she believed a miracle was coming, but because something had been crawling under her skin for weeks, a pattern she couldn't prove, a suspicion she refused to name out loud because naming it out loud would mean it was real. The lost contracts were too precise. Axiom's bids were too accurate. The timing of the leaks was too clean. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't market competition. This was a wound inflicted from the inside by someone who had access to everything. And Cass had a terrible feeling she already knew who. So tonight, instead of going home, she had stayed. She had dimmed the lights, spread the dissolution filing across her desk, pulled up the company's internal security dashboard on her monitor, access logs, file transfer records, login timestamps, all of it scrolling softly in the dark. And then she had leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She was not testing the security system. She was testing something far more difficult to measure, whether anyone inside these walls still had any integrity left. It was irrational, she knew that. But Cass had learned a long time ago that desperation sometimes sees what confidence refuses to look at. Nathan Cole had worked the overnight facilities shift at Mercer Tower for 3 years. He arrived every evening at 10 and clocked out at 6. His responsibilities were specific and unglamorous. Vacuum the upper floor corridors, empty the bins, wipe down the glass partitions, restock the restrooms on 38 through 42, and remain invisible. He was good at all of it, especially the last part. Before Nashville, before the mop and the cart and the sub-level break room with the broken vending machine, Nathan had spent 9 years as a network security specialist at a defense contractor in Huntsville, Alabama. He had built firewalls, run penetration tests, designed internal monitoring systems meant to catch exactly the kind of breach he was about to stumble into. He had been good at that work, genuinely good, and he had loved it the way people love things that feel like they were made for them. Then he had done the right thing at the wrong company. He had flagged an internal fraud scheme, documented it carefully, escalated it through proper channels, and the company had responded by quietly building a case against him instead. By the time it was over, Nathan had lost his position, his professional references, his industry standing, and, within 14 months, his marriage. He had moved to Nashville because it was far enough from Huntsville that he didn't have to see anyone who remembered him, and close enough to everything else that he could pretend he had chosen it. The overnight shift suited him. No decisions, no ambition, no one to disappoint or be disappointed by. For a man who had lost nearly everything trying to do the right thing, the quiet of empty hallways was not defeat. It was shelter. Tonight, Nathan pushed his cart down the 42nd floor corridor the same way he always did, steadily, without looking at anything that wasn't his business. The executive offices on this level were dark by 7 most evenings. The cleaning crew had the run of the building until dawn. He had mopped these floors 300 nights a year for 3 years, and not once had anyone on this floor noticed he was alive. He reached the corner office at the end of the hall and saw the light. Not bright, just a low, blue-white glow leaking under the door. He pushed it open slowly, expecting a forgotten desk lamp. Instead, he found a woman he recognized immediately, even slumped in her chair with her eyes closed. He had seen Cassandra Mercer in the lobby twice. Once in the elevator where she had been deep in a phone call and hadn't registered his existence. He knew who she was the way everyone in the building did, the way you know the name on the sign above the door. She existed several floors above anything he was part of. His job was the same as every other night. He stepped inside carefully, pulling his cart quietly behind him, keeping his movements slow so she wouldn't wake. That was when the monitor caught him. It was angled toward the door, the screen still live, casting a pale blue wash across the desk. Nathan wasn't trying to look, but the format on the display was one he had spent 9 years reading, and even from 6 feet away, something about the pattern pulled at a part of his brain he had spent 3 years trying to close down. It was an access log. Rows of login entries, file transfer records, session timestamps. Nathan knew this format the way a musician knows a chord, instinctively, in the body, before the brain catches up. And even from across the room, something was wrong. He stood still. The vacuum hummed softly near the door. Cass's breathing was slow and even. He should have turned around. A facilities tech had no business reading a CEO's security monitor. He knew that. He had a list, a very specific, very personal list, of reasons why involving himself in something like this would be the single worst decision he could make. He had already been through one version of this. He knew what happened to people like him when they saw things they weren't supposed to see and made the mistake of saying so. But the data was right there, and it was wrong in a way that was impossible to ignore. Several entries showed bulk file downloads occurring between 1 and 4 a.m. repeatedly over the past several weeks. The files were flagged as classified Tier 1 documents, pricing architecture, proprietary modeling algorithms, federal bid submissions, client infrastructure maps. And every single transfer was logged under the same account. V. Strand, Chief Operating Officer. Nathan's chest tightened in a way it hadn't in a long time. He knew the name. Victor Strand was Mercer Design's number 2, the man who stood beside Cass at every public appearance, the man whose headshot was on the lobby display under the words leadership, integrity, vision. According to the log still glowing on Cass Mercer's monitor, Victor Strand had been systematically downloading the company's most sensitive documents in the middle of the night, repeatedly, for months. Nathan stood in the silence of that office for what felt like a long time. The floor disinfectant, the soft hum of the vacuum, the breathing of the woman in the chair. Nobody knew he was here. Nobody would know what he had seen. He could mop the floor, push the cart to the next office, and by morning, whatever was happening at Mercer Design Systems would be someone else's problem. He was the overnight tech. This was not his fight. He had a life to protect. Small, quiet, carefully rebuilt from wreckage. Getting pulled into corporate espionage, into boardroom betrayal, into things 15 stories above his pay grade. That was the kind of decision that destroyed people. He knew because it had already destroyed him once, but he also knew what a compromised system looked like from the inside. He had seen it before. Smaller scale, different industry, same sickness. And he knew that if those logs were real, then the woman asleep in that chair wasn't failing because she was weak or wrong or unlucky. She was failing because someone she trusted was killing her company in the dark. Nathan looked at Cass, then at the screen. Then he reached into the back pocket of his work pants, took out his phone, and began photographing the logs. Every entry, every timestamp, every file name tied to Victor Strand's account. His hands were steady, his breathing was even. He wasn't being brave, he wasn't being reckless. He was simply a man who had once understood these systems well enough to recognize when one was being used as a weapon, and who still, despite everything, could not make himself look away. In the chair behind him, Cass Mercer kept her eyes closed. But behind those closed lids, she was wide awake. She had heard the faint click of the camera shutter. She had felt the shift in the room's silence when the tech stopped moving and started looking. And for the first time in months, something moved through her chest that wasn't dread. She didn't know what he would do with what he'd found. She didn't know if he'd act or stay quiet. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had seen it, and he had not looked away. Nathan did not leave the office immediately. He stood there another few seconds, checking each image on his phone, making sure every log entry was legible. Then he slipped the phone into his pocket, picked up his cart, and pushed it out of the corner office without a sound. The hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flat, indifferent, the way institutional lights always do. He walked to the service elevator, pressed the button, and waited. His face showed nothing, but his mind was already running, tracing data paths, estimating file volumes, reconstructing the logic of a breach he'd only glimpsed for a few minutes. He hadn't thought in these terms in 3 years. It came back fast. Muscle memory from a life he'd walked away from. By the time the elevator reached sub-level 2, Nathan had made a decision he didn't fully understand yet. He sat down on the metal bench in the maintenance break room, pulled out his phone, and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in over 4 years. Ray Okafor. Ray had worked alongside Nathan at the Huntsville contractor, a senior security analyst, sharp and methodical, the kind of person who never got rattled by bad data because bad data was his job. He had gone on to a private digital forensics firm in Atlanta. They hadn't spoken since Nathan left the industry. Nathan wasn't even sure Ray would answer at 2:47 in the morning. He pressed call. Ray picked up on the third ring. Nathan didn't explain everything. He said he had photographs of an access log that showed a pattern he couldn't dismiss, and that he needed someone he trusted to tell him whether he was reading it correctly or seeing things that weren't there. He said he couldn't explain where the photos came from or why he had them. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Send them." Nathan forwarded the images. He sat in the break room under the flickering fluorescent light, listening to the building hum around him. 11 minutes later, Ray called back. What Ray told him wasn't a surprise, but it still hit like cold water. The download pattern was consistent with textbook corporate data exfiltration. Large volume transfers during off hours, executed through an account with elevated clearance, targeting documents with competitive intelligence value. Ray said the timestamps were too deliberate to be accidental and too methodical to be a system malfunction. Someone had been systematically pulling strategic data from Mercer Design's servers for at least 2.5 months, possibly longer. And whoever was doing it knew exactly which files to take. Ray said one more thing before he hung up. If Nathan's photos were accurate, this was a federal matter. Corporate theft at this scale, especially involving a government contract, fell under FBI jurisdiction. "Be careful," Ray said, and then the line went dead. Nathan sat alone in the break room with his phone in his hands. He understood what Ray was saying. He also understood what it meant for him. He was an overnight facilities tech who had stood in a CEO's private office without invitation, observed a confidential security dashboard he had no clearance to access, and photographed classified company data on a personal device. If this went wrong, if the evidence was challenged, if Strand's lawyers moved fast enough, if the narrative got flipped, Nathan would not be seen as a whistleblower. He would be seen as a trespasser. Mercer Design's legal team could argue he'd violated his employment agreement, breached confidentiality protocols, accessed restricted systems outside his role. He could lose his job. He could face criminal charges. Everything he had rebuilt over 3 quiet years, the apartment in Germantown, the steady paycheck, the careful, unremarkable stability, could vanish in a week. He had already been through one version of this. He knew exactly what it cost. But he also knew that by 9 a.m., the woman on the 42nd floor was going to sign her company away to a board that didn't know the truth. Nathan opened his browser. He searched for the FBI's online tip submission portal. He uploaded the clearest photographs, every log entry, every timestamp. He wrote a factual, precise description of what the records showed. The account name, the file classifications, the download timeline, the pattern's consistency with competitive intelligence theft. He did not include his own name. He submitted the report, put his phone in his pocket, and went back to work. 4 floors above, Cass opened her eyes. The office was silent. The facilities cart was gone. A faint trace of floor disinfectant lingered near the door. She sat up slowly and looked at her monitor. The access logs were still scrolling. She had heard it all. The camera shutter, the careful retreat, the elevator chime fading into the building's background noise. What she hadn't expected was the weight of it. She had set this trap hoping to identify a thief. Instead, she had watched a man risk the one thing he had left to document a crime that had nothing to do with him. Cass leaned forward and began reading. It took her less than an hour to see the full picture. Victor Strand's account had initiated 187 classified file transfers over the past 83 days. The documents included Mercer's proprietary modeling algorithms, the complete technical submission for the federal green infrastructure contract, client acquisition roadmaps, internal pricing architecture, and a competitive vulnerability assessment that Cass had commissioned in absolute confidence. Every single transfer had occurred between 1 and 4 a.m., hours when the building was empty except for security and the overnight crew. She cross-referenced the download dates against the dates Mercer Design had lost each major client. They matched. Every time. Every single loss had followed within days of a bulk transfer from Victor's account. The company hadn't been outcompeted. It had been hollowed out, methodically, deliberately, by the one person Cass had trusted more than anyone in the organization. She sat back in her chair and looked at the vintage drafting compass in its wooden case on the corner of her desk. Vare had given a speech about that compass at a company dinner 6 years ago. He had said it represented what Mercer design was built on: a fixed point, a commitment to precision, the discipline to measure before you cut. She had felt moved by that speech. She had told him afterward that she didn't know anyone else who understood the company the way he did. She understood something different now. Victor Strand had been with her for 15 years. He had been her first hire when the firm outgrew her apartment and moved into real office space. He had stood beside her through every expansion, every crisis, every press conference. She had given him the title of Chief Operating Officer because she believed no one understood the company's architecture better than he did. And for at least the past 83 days, and likely much longer, he had been feeding that architecture to the highest bidder. Cass did not cry. She did not slam her hand on the desk. She sat in the blue-gray silence of her office and let the betrayal move through her the way cold water moves, all the way down, reaching every corner, leaving nothing unchanged. By 6:30 a.m., the building began its morning reset. Lights clicked on across the lower floors. Security changed shifts at the lobby desk. Elevators started moving with their familiar rhythm. At 7:50, Victor Strand walked through the main entrance in a charcoal blazer carrying 2 coffees. He rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, knocked twice on Cass's door, and stepped inside with the expression of a man who had practiced his concern the way an actor practices a monologue. He set one of the cups on her desk. "You stayed all night," he said. Not quite a question. His voice was warm, steady, calibrated to land somewhere between compassion and gravity. Cass looked at him. She felt something cold move through her stomach. Not anger yet, something quieter than anger. Recognition. "I had things to think through," she said. She picked up the coffee and said nothing about the logs. Victor sat across from her and began reviewing the board meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. He walked through the dissolution timeline, the asset liquidation sequence, the communication plan for employees and shareholders. He spoke with the fluency of a man who had already accepted the outcome. Or, Cass now understood, a man who had engineered it and was watching it close. She watched his mouth move and wondered how many times he had rehearsed this. At 8:15, board members began arriving. They filed into the glass-walled conference room one by one, setting down leather folders and water bottles. Warren Holt, the board chair, silver-haired, deliberate, a man who believed in process above almost everything, called the room to order at 8:45 with the kind of formal gravity reserved for events that are terrible but necessary. The dissolution filing sat open in front of Cass at the head of the table. 43 pages. Page 43, yellow tab. Victor sat 2 chairs to her left, hands folded, expression composed into what she now recognized as a masterpiece of performed sorrow. Cass picked up her pen. She could feel the room tighten. 8 pairs of eyes locked onto her hand as it moved toward the page. Warren Holt leaned forward slightly. Victor uncrossed and recrossed his legs. The clock on the wall read 8:58. The pen tip lowered toward the signature line. And then the conference room door opened. A woman in a dark suit stepped inside, followed by 2 others in matching plain clothes. She held up a badge and spoke in a clear, unhurried voice. "Special Agent Diane Flores, Federal Bureau of Investigation." They were there to execute a search warrant on the digital accounts and office of Victor Strand, Chief Operating Officer of Mercer Design Systems, in connection with an ongoing investigation into corporate espionage and theft of trade secrets. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of a meeting, the airless, ringing silence of a detonation. Victor Strand did not move. His hands stayed folded on the table, but something shifted in his face. The practiced sorrow dissolving into something harder, something that looked like rapid, cold calculation. He turned to Cass. "What is this?" The warmth was gone from his voice entirely. Cass met his eyes and said nothing. Warren Holt rose from his chair and began asking the agents by what authority they were interrupting a private board session. Agent Flores handed him a copy of the warrant without changing her pace. She turned to Victor and asked him to step away from the table. For a moment, no one moved. The board members looked at each other, then at Cass, then at Victor. The dissolution filing sat open on the table, unsigned, pen resting beside it where Cass had set it down. She did not pick it up again. Like and subscribe if you want to see how this ends. We're just getting to the part that matters. Agent Flores placed her hand on the back of Victor's chair. "Mr. Strand," she said, "please." Victor stood slowly. He buttoned his jacket with steady hands, looked once more at Cass, and the expression on his face in that moment was something she would think about for a long time afterward. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It was contempt. The contempt of a man who had believed he would never be caught, now recalculating. He walked out of the conference room without a word. The two agents followed. The door closed behind them, and the silence that remained was the heaviest thing Cass had felt since her father died. Warren Holt was the first to speak. He asked Cass quietly but directly whether she had known this was going to happen. Cass looked at him. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I did not know the FBI would walk through that door." Both of those things were true. She had set a trap to identify a thief. She had not expected someone else to spring it. Over the following 72 hours, the investigation moved with the mechanical precision of something that had been building toward this moment for a long time. Agent Flores and her team seized Victor's office computer, his company-issued devices, and his access credentials. A forensic audit of Mercer Design's servers confirmed everything the logs had shown. 187 classified file transfers over 83 days, all originating from Victor's account, all targeting documents that corresponded directly to contracts Axiom Build had subsequently won. The digital trail didn't stop at downloads. Investigators found encrypted communications between Victor and a senior vice president at Axiom Build, a man named Dale Cosgrove, detailing a payment arrangement tied to each contract Axiom secured using Mercer's stolen data. Victor had not acted out of ideology or old grievance. He had acted for money. The payments totaled $2, $6 million, routed through a Shell LLC registered in Wyoming and held in a personal account Victor's wife didn't know existed. When the evidence was presented to the full board, Warren Holt called a second emergency session. This time, the tone was different. The dissolution filing was pulled from the table. The liquidation plan was shelved. Mercer Design's legal team filed an immediate civil injunction against Axiom Build, citing theft of trade secrets and improper competitive advantage. Within 10 days, the federal green infrastructure contract that Axiom had won, the one built on Mercer's stolen technical framework, was suspended pending a procurement review. Within 3 weeks, 2 of the 4 enterprise clients who had walked away reached out to reopen conversations after learning that Axiom's competitive advantage had been manufactured, not earned. The company was not saved overnight. There were still debts to restructure, relationships to rebuild, and a gaping hole in the executive team where the COO had stood for 15 years. But the free fall had stopped. Mercer Design Systems was not dying anymore. It was wounded. It was standing. And for the first time in over a year, Cass could look at the company's future without seeing the end of it. But what stayed with her, what she kept returning to in the days and weeks after Victor was walked out of the building, was not the betrayal. She had begun processing that, folding it into the long catalog of hard lessons that come with 21 years of running a company. What stayed with her was Nathan Cole, a man who had cleaned her office 300 nights a year for 3 years, a man whose name she had never learned, a man she would not have recognized in a grocery store. He had stood in her office at 2 a.m. and seen something that had nothing to do with him, a problem he didn't cause, a company he didn't own, a woman he had never spoken to, and he had made a choice that put everything he had at risk. Not for money, not for recognition, not because anyone asked. She wanted to understand that. Cass found Nathan on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the FBI raid. She had asked the building's head of facilities where the overnight tech stationed on the upper floors could be found during his shift change. They pointed her to sublevel 2 with an expression that suggested this was an unusual request. She walked down the stairs, pushed open the maintenance room door without knocking, and found Nathan reorganizing supply shelves in the back of the room. He turned around and went very still. She was still in the blazer from her afternoon board meeting. She didn't have a speech prepared. She had thought about this moment for 3 weeks and never settled on what she was going to say. So she said what was true. She told him she knew what he had done. She told him she had been awake that night, that she had heard the camera, that she had watched him choose to act when every rational instinct said he should keep walking. Nathan didn't say anything right away. He set down the bottle of floor cleaner he had been holding. Then he said, "I didn't do it for the company." Cass waited. He looked at the shelf beside him for a moment before he looked back at her. "I did it because I used to be someone who understood those systems," he said. "And when I saw what was on that screen, I couldn't pretend I didn't understand it. That would have been a different kind of lie than the ones I was already telling myself." Cass was quiet for a moment. She didn't press him to explain further. She thought she understood more than he was saying, but the detail of it wasn't hers to pull out of him. Instead, she made him an offer. She told him that Mercer Design was building a new internal function, something she was calling the Integrity Systems Office. Its purpose would be to monitor internal data access, flag anomalies, and design the kind of structural safeguards that would make what Victor had done undetectable an impossibility rather than an oversight. She needed someone to lead it. Not a consultant, not an outside hire with a polished resume. Someone who understood these systems from the inside out. Someone who had proven, in the only way that actually counts, that their judgment could be trusted when no one was watching. Nathan looked at her for a long time. He didn't say yes. He asked whether she was offering him the position because she felt she owed him something. Cass shook her head. "I'm offering you this because you were the only person in this building who saw the truth and chose to act on it," she said. "Everyone else, including me, was either blind or afraid. You were neither." Nathan thought about it for 2 days. Then he accepted. 1 year later, Mercer Design Systems held its annual company address in the main auditorium on the ground floor. The room was full. Engineers and project leads, account managers and support staff, the maintenance crew and the security team, and everyone in between. Cass stood at the podium in a black blazer with no notes in front of her. The company had recovered. Revenue was growing. The federal contract had been reinstated. 4 new enterprise clients had signed in the previous quarter. The federal indictment against Victor Strand had been filed on 14 counts: corporate espionage, wire fraud, theft of trade secrets. His trial was pending. Axiom Build was under federal investigation and had lost 3 of its largest accounts. The numbers were good, but Cass didn't talk about the numbers. She talked about a night. She told the room that 1 year ago at 2 in the morning, she had sat in her office pretending to be asleep. She said she had done it because she no longer trusted anyone. Not her board, not her executive team, not even herself. She had wanted to know whether integrity still existed somewhere inside the walls of the company she had built, or whether everything she had constructed over 21 years had rotted quietly from the inside out without her noticing. She paused. Then she told them about the man who had come through her office door with a supply cart and a mop, who had seen something on her monitor that most people in the building, people with advanced degrees and equity stakes and executive titles, had either missed or looked away from for months. She didn't name him directly. She didn't need to. Most of the company already knew the story by then. What she said instead was this: "I spent 21 years building this company, and I nearly lost it because I had come to believe that the people who mattered most were the ones with the biggest offices and the longest titles. That was a mistake. Not because those people don't matter, but because I had stopped seeing everyone else. I had stopped seeing the people who keep this place running at 2 in the morning while the rest of us are home. I had stopped understanding that character doesn't live in job descriptions. It lives in the choices people make when no one is watching them. She gripped the edges of the podium and let her eyes move across the room. "I pretended to sleep that night to test someone else's integrity," she said. "But the truth is, he was the one who woke me up. He woke me up from the kind of arrogance that arrives so slowly, so quietly, that you don't even feel it settle in. The arrogance of believing that leadership means being the smartest person in the room, when what it actually means is being the one who sees the value in every person in the room, every single one." The auditorium went quiet. Not the polite, waiting quiet of a corporate event. The real kind. The kind that settles in when something lands somewhere unexpected and true. Nathan Cole sat in the fourth row in a gray suit that still felt slightly foreign on his frame. He didn't stand. He didn't wave. He sat with his hands resting on his knees and looked at the woman on the stage. The woman who had been slumped in a chair pretending to sleep while he mopped her floor. And he felt something shift in his chest. He had spent 3 years being invisible. He had spent 3 years telling himself that invisibility was enough, that staying small, staying unremarkable, staying below the line where decisions could hurt you was a reasonable price for the stability he'd managed to scrape back together. But sitting in that auditorium, hearing Cassandra Mercer tell a room full of people that the most consequential decision in the history of her company had been made by a man on the overnight shift with a phone camera and 60 seconds of nerve, Nathan understood something he had been circling around for a long time. He hadn't stopped being a network security specialist when he picked up a mop. He had only stopped believing he still was one. And believing it again. Not because someone told him to, not because the title had changed, but because he had proven it to himself in the dark, with no witnesses, when it would have been so much easier to walk away. That was the thing that finally, quietly, brought him back. There is a line in this story that is easy to miss, but it's the most important one. Nathan Cole did not act because he was certain it would work out. He acted knowing it might destroy him. Again. He had already paid the highest price once for doing the right thing at the wrong company, and he paid it anyway. That is not naivety. That is not recklessness. That is something that doesn't have a clean name, but most of us recognize it when we see it, because most of us have faced a version of that moment. The quiet hallway. The thing you're not supposed to see. The voice that says, "This isn't your problem. Stay small. Stay safe." The question this story asks is not whether you have power or a title or the right credentials. The question is what you do in the moment when you understand something that others are pretending not to. When you are the only one in the room who sees the truth clearly, and looking away would be so much easier than bearing the weight of it. Cass Mercer built a billion-dollar company, but she built it on a premise she had quietly forgotten. That the people who truly hold something together are not always the ones at the top of the org chart. Sometimes they are the ones you walk past in the hallway without seeing. Sometimes they are the ones who stay when everyone else goes home. And sometimes, if you are paying attention, if you have not become so accustomed to looking upward that you have forgotten to look at the people beside you, sometimes they are the ones who save everything. A company is not saved by strategy alone. It is saved by the people who still have something worth protecting, and who are willing to act on it, even in the dark, even alone, even when it costs them. That is the only infrastructure that never fails.